had sung grief for 3,000 years. She had given voice to the death of stars, the collapse of civilizations, the final breath of entities that existed beyond mortal understanding. In all that time, across all the dimensions she had traversed, mourning had followed the same fundamental rules. Grief was a wavelength. Loss was a frequency. The Resonance Council had mapped every possible expression of sorrow in the known multiverse and could perform them all with perfect precision. The mourned in subsonic pulses that made the ground tremble. The crystallized their sadness into geometric patterns of frozen light. The released clouds of sent memory that told the story of the departed. Each species had their way, and each way made sense. The mourning choirs existed to honor all of them, to carry grief across dimensional barriers so that no loss went unwitnessed. When the signal came from Sector 7G, responded as she always did. Her form shifted through dimensions, following the thread of sorrow to its source. She expected another standard assignment, perhaps a Kelvin's death ceremony or a dissolution. Instead, she found herself hovering above a small blue planet in a previously uncontacted dimension. The grief signature was wrong. That was her first thought. It didn't match any known pattern. It contained contradictions that shouldn't exist together. Rage and peace, despair and hope, anger at death itself, yet acceptance of its inevitability. The signal pulsed with chaotic energy that violated every principle of harmonic mourning. Descended to investigate. She found herself in a structure the local species called a church. The beings inside were bipedal, fragile-looking things made of meat and bone. Humans, according to the dimensional database. A primitive species, barely aware of the greater multiverse. They had only just begun to explore their own star system. One of the humans stood before the others, and when she opened her mouth, sound emerged. Not the pure tones expected, but something rough and imperfect. The human's voice cracked on certain notes. Her timing wavered, yet the sound carried such weight that felt herself drawn closer. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The words meant nothing to at first. She needed a moment to translate them through her dimensional interface. But even before the meaning became clear, the emotion hit her like a physical force. This human was singing about loss and redemption simultaneously, about being lost and being found, about blindness and sight. Every line contained opposites that shouldn't coexist. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. The other humans joined in. Their voices blended together in imperfect harmony. Some sang off-key. Others couldn't quite reach the high notes. One elderly human's voice shook with age and grief. None of it was technically correct by the standards new, yet the cumulative effect was devastating. She accessed the database and discovered this was a funeral song. The humans sang it when someone died. But unlike any death ritual had encountered, this song didn't just express sadness. It expressed gratitude. It acknowledged suffering while celebrating transcendence. It contained multitudes. Tried to analyze it mathematically. She broke down the frequencies, mapped the harmonic progressions, calculated the emotional wavelengths. Nothing made sense. The song violated the fundamental laws of grief expression. Different emotional states couldn't occupy the same space. Loss and hope were incompatible frequencies. Yet here they were, woven together in a simple melody sung by beings who didn't even know other dimensions existed. She attempted to reproduce the song herself. Her kind didn't have physical vocal cords, but she could generate any sound through harmonic manipulation. She matched the notes perfectly, corrected the timing, smoothed out the imperfections. The result was technically flawless. It was also completely wrong. The power was gone. Whatever made the human version work had vanished when perfected it. She tried again, this time deliberately introducing errors. She made her voice crack like the first humans had. She wavered on the timing. She missed a note intentionally. Something shifted. The song suddenly carried weight again, not as much as the human version but enough that realized something profound. The imperfections weren't flaws, they were essential, they were the point. She recorded everything and returned to the Resonance Council with her findings. The council convened in their great hall, a space that existed in all dimensions simultaneously. Thousands of mourning choirs gathered to hear her report. "I have found something impossible," announced. "A species that breaks every rule of grief expression, yet creates mourning songs more powerful than anything in our archives." She played the recording of Amazing Grace. The effect on the council was immediate and shocking. Beings who had maintained perfect emotional control found themselves overwhelmed. A choir member spontaneously crystallized, his grief light forming patterns never before seen, dissolved into a cloud of confused scents. Even the ancient representatives felt their subsonic pulses synchronize with the strange human rhythm. "This is not possible," the council leader said, but his voice carried uncertainty. "Grief cannot contain hope. Loss cannot coexist with gratitude. These are opposite states." "That's what I thought," replied, "so I investigated further." She had spent weeks on Earth, invisible to the humans, observing their mourning practices. What she found everything she knew. At one funeral, the humans laughed while crying. They told stories about the deceased that were funny, even irreverent, while simultaneously weeping. At another ceremony, they sang songs that celebrated life while openly acknowledging death's cruelty. She had watched an Irish wake where the mourners drank and sang and danced around the body of their dead friend. She had observed a New Orleans funeral where a brass band led a procession through the streets, playing music that was simultaneously mournful and jubilant. She had witnessed a gospel service where the pain of loss transformed into something approaching joy. None of it made sense, all of it worked. "I have compiled a database of human funeral songs," continued. "There are thousands of them, spanning centuries of their history. Each one contains these same contradictions. Each one somehow expresses multiple incompatible emotional states, and each one is more effective at processing grief than anything we have created in 10 million years of mourning practice." She played more recordings. "On Heaven's Door" by an artist called Bob, where acceptance and protest existed in the same lyrics. "Hallelujah" by a song about love and loss and faith and doubt all tangled together. "Who Wants to Live Forever" by a group called Queen, which questioned the value of immortality while mourning its impossibility. The council listened in stunned silence. Each song was technically imperfect. Human voices cracked and wavered. Instruments occasionally hit wrong notes. The timing was loose, almost casual, yet each song carried an emotional truth that perfect technique couldn't capture. "How is this possible?" someone asked. "They're a primitive species. They've barely left their own planet. They don't even know we exist." "I don't know," admitted, "but I have a theory. We have spent eons perfecting the mathematics of grief. We have made mourning into a science. We can calculate the exact frequency of loss, the precise harmonic of sorrow. But in doing so, I think we've forgotten something essential." She paused, trying to formulate thoughts that went against everything her kind believed. "Grief isn't meant to be perfect. It's meant to be real. These humans, they don't try to separate their emotions into neat categories. When they mourn, they feel everything at once. The sadness, yes, but also the love they had for the deceased, the anger at death itself, the gratitude for the time they had, the hope that somehow, somewhere, there's something beyond. They don't try to make sense of it. They just let it exist all together all at once." The council chamber erupted in debate. Some argued that this was chaos, not mourning. Others insisted that emotional discipline was essential to proper grief processing. But a growing number found themselves drawn to these strange human songs, listening to them repeatedly, feeling something they hadn't felt in centuries. One of the eldest council members, a being who had existed since the first mourning choirs were formed, finally spoke. Her voice carried the weight of ages. "I remember," she said quietly, "when grief was new, when our kind first learned to give voice to loss. It was messy then, chaotic. We thought we were improving it by making it orderly, but perhaps we were losing something instead. She listened to Amazing Grace again, and for the first time she felt her perfect control slip. She felt the contradictions the song contained, and instead of trying to resolve them, she simply let them be. We need to learn from these humans, she declared. Send delegations, study their practices, understand how they achieve what we cannot. The council voted, and the motion passed. Within days, the word spread across dimensional barriers. Humans, a species barely visible on the cosmic scale, had somehow created something the entire multiverse needed to understand. Returned to Earth to begin the real work. She didn't know yet how these primitive beings had discovered truths that eluded civilizations millions of years old, but she intended to find out. And in doing so, she would help change how every species in every dimension understood the simple, terrible, beautiful act of saying goodbye. The arrival of the delegations caused immediate problems. Earth's governments didn't know what to make of beings who existed in multiple dimensions, simultaneously trying to contact them about funeral music. The first few attempts at communication resulted in confusion, panic, and several hastily called emergency UN sessions. The Resonance Council eventually decided on a simpler approach. They would ask permission formally and explain exactly what they wanted. Was chosen as the primary ambassador, mostly because she'd spent the most time studying humans and had the best grasp of their strange, contradictory nature. She materialized in front of the UN General Assembly, which in retrospect might not have been the most subtle choice. The appearance of a being made of harmonic energy who existed in 17 dimensions at once caused several delegates to faint, but had learned that humans responded well to directness. "We come in peace," she said, using a translation matrix that rendered her harmonic voice into something humans could understand. "We are the mourning choirs, beings who give voice to grief across all realities. We have discovered that your funeral songs are the most powerful expressions of loss in the known multiverse. We wish to learn from you." The silence that followed was profound. Then one of the delegates, a woman from Ghana, started laughing, not mockingly but with genuine disbelief. "You're telling me," she said, "that you can travel between dimensions, you exist as pure energy, you've probably witnessed the birth and death of galaxies, and you want to learn about grief from us." "Yes," replied simply. "Why?" "Because your songs contain truths we have forgotten, because you mourn in ways we cannot, because in all the universe, across all dimensions, only humans seem to understand that grief doesn't have to make sense to be real." The debate that followed lasted 3 days. Some wanted to refuse, arguing this was clearly some kind of trick. Others worried about the theological implications. A few suggested charging consultation fees. But eventually, a consensus emerged, driven largely by people who had recently lost someone and understood what was really asking for. "You want to attend our funerals," an elderly man from South Korea said. "You want to see how we mourn." "Yes." "Then come, bring your delegations. Watch, listen, learn. We've never hidden how we grieve. We do it in public, in private, in churches and temples and living rooms. If it helps someone else somewhere else, then you're welcome to it." And so they came. Beings of light and energy and pure mathematics materialized at funerals across Earth. At first, their presence was jarring. How do you mourn your grandmother when a creature made of crystallized starlight is hovering in the corner of the church? But humans adapted, as they always did. Within weeks, the observers became just another strange part of the funeral process. Attended a funeral in rural Ireland. The deceased was an old farmer, and his wake was held in his own home. She watched as his friends and family gathered, drinking whiskey and telling stories. They laughed at his stubbornness, cried at his absence, and sang songs that celebrated his life while openly acknowledging his faults. He had been difficult, they agreed, stubborn as a mule. But he'd also been loyal and brave and had once walked 3 miles in a snowstorm to bring medicine to a neighbor's sick child. A observer tried to process this. They speak poorly of the deceased. This violates standard mourning protocol. The dead are to be honored, their negative qualities forgotten. They speak truthfully of him, corrected. They honor him by remembering him as he was, not as an idealized version. The love is deeper because it acknowledges the flaws. The wake lasted until dawn. They sang The Parting Glass, an old Irish farewell song. The voices were rough with alcohol and emotion. Every person singing had known the old farmer. Every voice carried personal memories. The song was sloppy and perfect and heartbreaking. The began to crystallize, his grief form taking new shapes. "I don't understand," he said, "but I feel it." Attended a funeral in New Orleans. A young woman had died in a car accident and her family held a jazz funeral. The mourners dressed in white and followed a brass band through the streets. The music started slow and mournful, but as the procession moved from the church to the cemetery, it transformed. The tempo increased. The mourners began to dance. They called it the second line, a tradition of celebrating the deceased's passage to the next world. A representative from the collective couldn't process it. "They dance at death. This is disrespectful." But watched the young woman's mother who danced while tears streamed down her face. The movement wasn't denial of grief. It was defiance against despair. It said, "Yes, my daughter is dead, and yes, my heart is shattered, but I will still celebrate that she lived. I will still move and breathe and exist, even though she cannot." They played "I'll Fly Away," and the mother sang along, her voice breaking on every word, dancing all the while. Attended a Buddhist funeral in Thailand, where the monks chanted for hours in the presence of the body. The sound was meditative, cyclical, an acknowledgement that death was part of the natural order. Yet even in this acceptance, there was grief. The family wept quietly while the monks chanted. The deceased's daughter touched her father's hand one last time before the cremation. She attended a gospel funeral in Atlanta, where the choir sang "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot" with such power that the church walls seemed to vibrate. The mourners clapped and swayed and called out "Amen" and "Yes, Lord" between verses. They transformed the pain of loss into something transcendent, insisting that death was not an ending but a transition. Yet they wept even as they celebrated. The contradictions didn't diminish either emotion. They amplified both. She attended a quiet funeral in Japan, where an elderly woman had died at 97. Her family spoke softly about her life. They performed the rituals with precision and grace. A granddaughter sang a lullaby the old woman had sung to her as a child. Her voice was barely above a whisper, cracking with grief. It was the opposite of the gospel funeral's exuberance, yet it carried the same emotional truth. Over months, delegations from across the multiverse witnessed thousands of human funerals. They saw every variation, every cultural approach, every personal adaptation. They heard bagpipes wail in Scotland, heard flamenco guitars weep in Spain, heard throat singers perform in Mongolia. They heard punk rock bands play at memorial services, heard children sing off-key at their parents' funeral, heard elderly couples say goodbye to spouses of 70 years. What struck them most was the sheer variety. Humans didn't have a single approach to grief. They had thousands, and all of them worked. All of them helped the living process the death of the loved one. All of them honored the deceased while acknowledging the pain of loss. They who had mourned in identical subsonic pulses for 10 million years found this variety disturbing at first. How could grief be so different from person to person? Where was the universal standard? But then an observer attended a funeral where a man sang "Tears in Heaven" for his dead daughter. The song was written after his own son's death. The man's voice was terrible. He couldn't hit the notes. He had to stop several times to compose himself. But he kept singing, tears running down his face, because this was his daughter and these were his feelings and technical perfection didn't matter. The observer felt his subsonic pulse shift, incorporating new frequencies. For the first time in his species' history, mourned imperfectly, and in doing so, mourned more truly than any of his kind had in eons. The collective of sorrow, a hive-minded species that experienced all emotions as a shared consciousness, had the most profound transformation. They attended a funeral where different family members each sang a different song for the deceased. A son sang "My Way," celebrating his father's independence. A daughter sang "What a Wonderful World," remembering her father's optimism. A grandson played "Stairway to Heaven" on guitar, stumbling over the difficult passages. Each song expressed a different facet of grief. Each person mourned differently. And for the collective, who had always experienced loss as a single, unified emotional state, this was revolutionary. They began to understand that grief could be personal, individual, unique to each relationship. One of the collective's drones separated from the hive mind. It was unheard of, impossible. Yet when exposed to the idea that grief could be individual, this drone found itself feeling loss as a singular entity. It mourned not as part of a collective consciousness, but as itself. The other drones felt it happen and were changed by it. Within days, the collective had ceased to be truly collective. Each drone maintained connection with the others but experienced emotions individually. They called it the Great Awakening, and they credited humanity with teaching them what it meant to be individuals. Compiled everything into a report for the Resonance Council. The data was overwhelming. Hundreds of cultures, thousands of songs, millions of variations in how humans approached death, but certain patterns emerged. Humans didn't separate emotions. They felt everything at once and didn't apologize for it. They mourned imperfectly and considered that imperfection essential. They adapted their grief to their relationship with the deceased. They mixed celebration with sorrow, hope with despair, anger with acceptance. They made mistakes during funeral services and considered those mistakes part of the process. Most importantly, they did it together. Human mourning was communal. They gathered physically to witness each other's grief. They sang together, cried together, laughed together, supported each other. The songs weren't performed by perfect voices trained for. They were sung by regular people, amateurs, individuals who just wanted to honor someone they loved. The conclusion is clear, told the council. We have been approaching grief wrong. Not incorrect exactly, but incomplete. We have perfected the technical aspects while losing the essential truth. Mourning isn't a frequency to be calculated. It's an experience to be survived together, imperfectly, honestly. The council leader, the ancient being who had first validated its findings, nodded slowly. Then we must change, she said. After millions of years, we must learn to mourn like humans, not to copy them exactly, but to remember what they never forgot, that grief is meant to be felt, not perfected. The decision was made. Human funeral songs would be incorporated into the mourning practices of every species in the Resonance Council, not to replace existing traditions, but to remind everyone that loss was personal, chaotic, contradictory, and real. Word spread quickly across dimensional barriers. Within weeks, beings from 1,000 realities were seeking out human funeral music. A dissolution ceremony incorporated on Heaven's Door. A Kelvin remembrance ritual added Hallelujah to their traditional chants. The who had not truly changed their mourning practices in 10,000 years began allowing individual choir members to sing solos, imperfectly, personally. But there was one final test coming, one that would determine whether these lessons had truly been learned. And it would require humans to teach the oldest beings in existence how to die. The message came through channels the Resonance Council didn't even know existed. It bypassed their communication networks, appeared simultaneously in every dimensional archive, and spoke with a voice that resonated across all of reality. The Eternal Ones were dying. Had heard stories about them, of course. Every civilization had. The Eternal Ones existed outside normal spacetime. They had witnessed the birth of the first universe and would presumably witness the heat death of the last. They didn't exist in linear time the way other species did. Past, present, and future were all equally real to them. They were, for all practical purposes, immortal. Except now they weren't. "We have chosen to end," the message said. "We have existed for too long. We have seen too much. We have witnessed every possible outcome of every possible timeline. We know everything that was, is, and will be. There are no more surprises, no more discoveries, no more reason to continue." The message requested the Resonance Council's presence. The Eternal Ones wanted a death ceremony. They wanted to be mourned. The council convened in emergency session. Panic rippled through the assembly. The Eternal Ones dying wasn't just unprecedented. It was conceptually difficult to process. How do you mourn beings who existed outside time? How do you grieve for entities who had witnessed the universe's beginning and would have witnessed its end? What songs do you sing for the death of eternity itself? "This is beyond our capabilities," one council member said. "We have mapped every form of grief in the multiverse, but we've never mapped grief for something that shouldn't be able to die." "The traditional approaches won't work," another agreed. "The subsonic pulses express loss within time. The crystals capture moments of grief. The clouds carry memories forward. But the Eternal Ones exist outside all of that. How do we mourn something that transcends the very framework of our mourning practices?" The debate continued for hours. Every suggestion was inadequate. Every traditional approach failed before it began. The more they discussed it, the more impossible the task seemed. Finally spoke. "We need the humans." Silence fell over the chamber. "That's absurd," someone said. "The Eternal Ones are cosmic entities. Humans are barely aware of their own dimension, let alone the nature of eternal existence. What could they possibly contribute?" "Everything," replied. "Don't you see? That's exactly why we need them. The Eternal Ones know everything that was, is, and will be. They exist outside time. They've calculated every possible outcome. They're dying because they've perfected existence itself, and in doing so, lost the reason to exist." She paused, making sure everyone understood. "They're dying of the same thing we almost died of. They've made life so perfect, so complete, so totally understood that it's lost all meaning. We did the same thing with grief. We perfected it until it became meaningless. The humans taught us that imperfection is essential. Maybe they can teach the Eternal Ones the same thing." The council leader considered this. "You're suggesting we bring primitive beings before the oldest entities in existence and ask them to sing funeral songs?" "Yes. It's either brilliant or catastrophic, possibly both." "Probably both," agreed, "but I can't think of another option." The vote was close, but it passed. A delegation would go to Earth and request human assistance. They would explain the situation as clearly as possible and hope that somehow, these short-lived beings who barely understood their own mortality could help eternal beings face their chosen death. Returned to Earth with several other council members. They appeared before the same UN assembly they had addressed months before. The humans were less shocked this time, which appreciated. "We need your help again," she said. "The oldest beings in existence are dying. They've asked to be mourned. We don't know how. We were hoping you might." The silence that followed was different from before. Last time, it had been shocked disbelief. This time, it was the silence of people trying to understand something beyond their comprehension. The delegate from Ghana spoke first. "You want us to sing at a funeral for beings that exist outside time itself?" "Yes." "Do they even understand what a funeral song is? From their perspective, wouldn't they already know everything we're going to sing?" "Probably," admitted. "But knowing something and experiencing it are different things. You taught us that. Your songs work not because they're surprising, but because they're true." A delegate from India raised his hand. "If they know everything, then they already know whether this will work or not. They know if they'll actually die or if something will change their minds. They know the outcome." "They do," confirmed. "And they still asked for this. They still want to be mourned by someone. That has to mean something. The discussion went on for hours. Philosophers and theologians joined via video conference. Everyone had opinions about whether this was even possible, let alone advisable. But eventually, the same elderly man from South Korea who had spoken up before raised his voice. "My wife died last year," he said quietly. 63 years we were married. When she was dying, she knew it was coming. The doctors told us weeks in advance. She had time to say goodbye, to put her affairs in order. She knew exactly what was going to happen. And you know what she asked for?" He paused and could see tears forming in his eyes. "She asked me to sing to her, our wedding song. I have a terrible voice. She knew I had a terrible voice. She'd heard me sing that song 1,000 times over 6 decades. There was nothing new or surprising about it. But she wanted to hear it one more time, sung badly by someone who loved her as she left this world." He looked at directly. "So yes, I'll go sing for your eternal beings. Not because I understand them. Not because I think I have something they don't already know. But because everyone, no matter how old or how wise or how eternal, deserves to be mourned by someone when they die." Others volunteered. A gospel choir from Atlanta, led by a woman named Grace whose voice could shake windows. A Tibetan monk who had spent 40 years studying death and rebirth. A punk rock singer from London named Sarah who had written songs about loss and rage. A classical pianist from Russia. A folk singer from Australia. A Japanese grandmother who knew old songs her own grandmother had taught her. They were a strange group, united only by their willingness to do something impossible. Looked at them and felt something she hadn't felt in 3,000 years of existence. She felt hope. The Resonance Council transported them to the place where the Eternal Ones existed. It wasn't a place in the traditional sense. It was a space between spaces, a moment that contained all moments. The humans found it disorienting at first. They could see their own births and deaths simultaneously. They could perceive every version of themselves that had ever existed or would exist. "This is going to take some getting used to," Grace said, watching herself as a child and as an old woman at the same time. The Eternal Ones manifested in a form the humans could perceive. They appeared as lights, vast and ancient, containing within them the history of everything. When they spoke, it was with voices that echoed across time itself. "You came," they said. "We knew you would. We've watched your species since you first climbed down from trees. We've seen every funeral you've ever held, every song you've ever sung. We know how your story ends." "Then why did you ask us here?" the Korean man asked. "If you already know everything, what can we give you?" "The experience of it," the Eternal Ones replied. "We know the notes you'll sing. We know the words you'll say, but we've never felt them directed at us. We've never been mourned. We've watched others grieve for countless eons, but we've never been the subject of grief. We want to know what it feels like just once before we end." The humans looked at each other. Then Grace stepped forward. "We'll do our best," she said. "We're going to be terrible at this, just so you know. We're going to hit wrong notes and forget words and probably cry in the middle. But that's kind of the point, I think." "We know," the Eternal One said. "That's why we asked for you." The funeral, if it could be called that, began. There was no body, no coffin, no traditional structure. Just humans and eternal beings in a space outside time, attempting something that had never been done before. Grace's choir started with "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." Their voices rose together, imperfect and powerful. They sang about chariots coming to carry someone home, about bands of angels waiting. The words were simple, almost childlike, but the emotion behind them was vast. The Eternal Ones listened. They had known these words for eternity. They had watched this song being written, watched it being sung at thousands of funerals across centuries. But hearing it sung for them was different. The knowledge was the same. The feeling was new. The Tibetan monk chanted next. His death meditation spoke of impermanence, of the cycle of existence, of letting go. He had performed this chant hundreds of times, but never for beings who had existed forever. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Teaching immortal beings about impermanence seemed absurd, yet the chant carried weight in this space. Sarah the punk singer went next. She had written her own song for this occasion, staying up all night on the journey here. It was angry and raw and honest. She sang about the unfairness of death, the rage at losing someone, the refusal to accept that people just disappeared. She sang with a snarl in her voice, accompanying herself on a battered guitar. "This is bullshit," she sang. "You shouldn't have to go. I know you're ancient and eternal and probably right about everything, but I'm still angry you're choosing to die. And I'm allowed to be angry because grief isn't rational and death isn't fair, and I don't have to be okay with this." The Eternal Ones had never heard anyone be angry at them before. They existed outside normal cause and effect. They couldn't be blamed for anything because they didn't interfere with events. But Sarah blamed them anyway, for choosing to leave, for giving up, for deciding that eternity was too much to bear. "You're allowed to be tired," she sang, "but I'm allowed to be mad about it." The Russian pianist played Chopin's Funeral March, then transitioned into a piece he had written himself. The music was complex and beautiful and imperfect. His fingers stumbled on certain passages. He didn't care. He played through his mistakes, letting the imperfection become part of the performance. The folk singer from Australia sang The Parting Glass, her voice rough and honest. The Japanese grandmother sang a lullaby that was centuries old, rocking slightly as she sang, as if comforting a child to sleep. Each song was different. Each one expressed grief in a unique way. Together, they created something the Eternal Ones had never experienced. They were being mourned not with perfect technique or cosmic understanding, but with human emotion. Messy, contradictory, imperfect human emotion. Finally, the Korean man stepped forward. He was old and his voice shook, but he sang the song he had sung to his dying wife. A simple folk song about love and parting. He sang it badly, just as he had for her. He cried while singing, just as he had then. "I don't understand you," he said when the song ended. "I can't comprehend eternal existence or why you choose to end it, but I understand loss. I understand what it feels like to watch something precious disappear. So I'm sorry you're going. Even though I just met you, even though you're nothing like me, I'm sorry you're leaving." The Eternal Ones were quiet for a long moment. The humans couldn't tell if they were moved or disappointed or unchanged. These were beings beyond mortal comprehension. Maybe the whole thing had been pointless. Then the lights that represented the Eternal Ones began to dim, not fading exactly but withdrawing, preparing to let go. "Thank you," they said. "We have existed for more time than your species can conceive. We have witnessed wonders and horrors beyond description. We have calculated every possible outcome of every possible event. We have known everything there is to know. And in all that time, across all that existence, we have never felt what we felt just now." "What did you feel?" Grace asked. "Mourned," the Eternal Ones replied. "Truly mourned. Not observed, not calculated, not understood, but grieved for by beings who barely know us, who have no logical reason to care if we exist or not, yet chose to care anyway. You sang imperfectly, cried unexpectedly, and felt emotions you couldn't fully articulate. And somehow, that meant more than all the perfect knowledge we've accumulated across eternity." The lights dimmed further. "We spent forever trying to understand everything. You spend your brief lives trying to feel everything. We thought your approach was primitive. We were wrong. You were wiser all along. Will you still?" Couldn't finish the question. "Yes," the Eternal One said. "We're still choosing to end. But now we end knowing that we were cared about even briefly by someone. That's enough. That's more than enough." They began to fade. As they did, they shared one final gift. Every being present, human and otherwise, felt a moment of connection. They saw through the Eternal One's perspective for just an instant. They saw all of time laid out, every moment that had been or would be. It was beautiful and terrible and overwhelming. And then the eternal ones were gone, simply gone. The oldest beings in existence had chosen non-existence, and the universe had one less constant. The humans stood in silence. They had just